Be authentic. But what if being so-called authentic could cause you harm or cause somebody else some harm? Had a really interesting conversation with Suzanne Wertheim, who's a linguistic anthropologist. And in her studies and in our conversation, we talked about the importance of language and also this idea of authenticity. If you're a member of a marginalized group, it could be that that mask or that shield that you wear, in part, is what helps you to succeed or thrive, be successful in the organization that you work in. So there's a really interesting tension at play there around authenticity, what it actually means, and what it can mean for those in marginalized groups. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Well, take a listen. Hope you enjoy the conversation. And if you do, I encourage you to pass it on to somebody else that would enjoy it. We talk about the importance of inclusive language. And I hope, like me, having been through this conversation, it really helps you to think about the type of language that you're using to help encourage others to belong in the workplace. Enjoy. And welcome, Suzanne Wertheim, to our After Dinner Leadership podcast and conversation. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Simon. A pleasure to be here.
And first off, you are a linguistic anthropologist. Could you just help us understand, what does that actually mean?
Sure. It means that I was trained in and for a long time a professor of a field that no one's ever heard of because we've done the worst job of public relations of almost any field. But it's really pretty basic. For my work in particular, I was always looking at how language and power and culture interact. But it's as basic as, do you speak to other people? And does your language have meaning that's not just in the words? Then yes, that's what I was studying. And I could get very, very specific about the message that's sort of underneath the message.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to go into that a little later. I mean, specifically with the focus on use of inclusive language, but the broader topic of just seeing how language works is something that I tune into a lot personally, just in people speaking. When I'm coaching somebody, I love listening for the words that are being used in that context, and what and when I'm being coached, the choice of words that I have when I'm being coached is really interesting to me, what it is portraying. But yeah.
Well, and I think that another thing I'll say is that we become incredible experts at finding, digging up, and analyzing language patterns. So especially in a coaching situation, a shift in language can show some kind of other shift, a mental shift or a shift in vision, right? So if somebody stops saying I so much to talk about how they're a leader and starts talking more about their team, right? You can see that as a pattern and say, oh, this person has shifted. And instead of being like, how am I being perceived? They're really starting to shift the focus to, how can I be in better service as a leader to these team members? So
yeah, it's a really good example. And one of our traditions is to ask a set of quick-fire questions, or random quick-fire questions, to our guests, and 1 minute. And it's an interesting way. Well, I find it an interesting way to find out about someone, other than asking, "Tell me about your life history." So that's what we've got today, and we can discuss some of the answers to this once we're done. Are you ready?
I guess I am ready. Let's do it. I'm from New York, so quick fire questions and answers are kind of how I was raised. So I think I'll be okay.
Perfect. Thank you. Name?
Suzanne Wertheim.
Organization?
Worthwhile Research and Consulting.
What is your life motto?
Don't try for perfection so much.
Dream holiday destination?
Oh, Costa Rica right now.
What is a tradition you do around this time of year?
Oh, that's a good question. I try to figure out how to hike. Every year I try to figure out how to hike when it's rainy and foggy.
Okay. How would you describe yourself in 3 words?
Short, insightful, other-oriented. That had a hyphen in it.
Okay. I'll let it go. What's your favorite color?
I wear black a lot.
Oh, that was a very meaningful conversation there. Let's get into that. The hiking piece, particularly. Let me just go there first of all. What's significant about the hiking in fog?
Well, if I turn to my left and I look out my window, it's a deeply foggy day today where I am in the San Francisco Bay Area, where the fog is actually touching the ground and reaching the trees. And I have a tradition, so I'm about to stop work. Um, this week is my last week in the office. This is the
Yep.
final podcast I'll be doing this year. And I like to have a tradition of self-care when I've stopped thinking so much about the care of others. How do I nourish myself? And I nourish myself through, I guess Scandinavians call it forest bathing, or I'm adjacent to very, very lovely woods and trees. And I love to be quiet. People who know me will find this maybe surprising, but I love to be quiet and walk in the woods. But every year, I can't quite figure out the rain gear with like comfortable shoes and a comfortable hat and I guess a Mac or whatever that works well but is light enough. Like literally, you'd think by now I'd have figured it out. So the tradition is, how can I get more out into forests
Yes.
to self nourish? And then the problem is, what are the actual logistics that I keep on failing at? So
Wow. And you're in the vicinity of the Redwoods National Park, are you? Is it that kind of area? And
yes, it's not
yeah.
just Redwood National Park, but there are smaller parks that only local people know about. I can actually be in Redwoods if I drive 12 minutes to the starting point and then give me about 15 minutes of walking and I'm in fantastic
Yeah.
new growth because they stupidly cut them all down.
Sure.
But still fantastic new growth redwoods. So literally 20 minutes from where I'm talking to you.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah. It's on my bucket list to get over that side of the states. I've traveled through the states quite a lot, but not been to San Francisco area. So yeah, I'll get there
Highly
one day.
recommend.
It's great. And you mentioned other oriented as a description of yourself. Could you help me understand what that means?
Sure. So in my field, I do a lot of work um, helping people see the world the way I feel lucky enough to see it. And this is an outgrowth of a lot of us in my field. So some of the work I do is called diversity, equity, inclusion work. There are other kinds of work, but and also even being a professor. There's a lot of sacrifice involved in being a professor. You were impoverished for all of grad school. You're not getting paid a lot as a professor. It takes up so much of your time. You have to be so other oriented to be like, I'm going to set a lot of my life on hold in order to make sure that people are getting the education that I think is so valuable. And so, yeah, I spend a lot of my time thinking about what are the problems that I'm lucky enough to see because of my education and the luxury I've had to spend so much time researching things that other people just haven't had time to dwell in. And so now there's a certain clarity to my vision that I like to impart to other people as much as possible. And honestly, this is one of the things that brings me the most satisfaction, but also it can be you empty yourself out and then you need to replenish. So
Yeah, I love that idea. If you don't mind sharing, how long is the break that you take just to recharge and renew? How long does that last?
yeah, this year it's 3 weeks and change.
Right.
If I can, last year I wrote my book and I took a whole month. Having said that, part of that month was overseeing bathroom remodeling. So
Right.
not as restful as it might have been. But if possible, I take off all of December if I can.
Yeah. Yeah. I had a holiday this summer and the team's grown, and I felt like I was in a position to be able to properly switch off. And it was the first time I'd done that for quite a few years. And it was such a lovely thing. One, to have a team that were capable and, you know, confident to be able to respond to any queries that may have come in. But also, two, for me to be able to properly shut down for 2 weeks was a real privilege, and helped a lot to get my head, rebalanced, ready to go into the next kind of the next phase of work. I'd love to just get another insight. Again, a question I ask each of our guests is: what 3 leadership lessons do you wish you'd learned earlier?
I think one is that I could be a leader without filling all of the requirements right away. This is a very
Yep.
feminine trait. right?
Yeah.
Another is that when you show up as a person, including vulnerability, that can work in your favor. If you show up as a person working with people rather than some sort of projection of leadership that's sort of like a mask or a shield in front of you. But then also, honestly, that the third lesson is how variable the privilege is to be able to show up as a vulnerable person, that not everybody gets that much privilege. And some people do really require that shield, that there's not a one size fits all, because some people, because of how they look and how they're perceived, um, people are assuming they're incompetent or get very angry if they speak with authority, or there's a lot more work that goes into being in a leadership position for some kind of people because of what we call their socio-demographics, they're who
Yeah.
they are, than I had to do. And so I can't take my leadership lessons. So I'm technically white. I don't look super white, but I'm technically white. I grew up middle class. I'm a native speaker of American English. There are a lot of ways that there were things that were easy for me in leadership positions that weren't as easy for colleagues of mine who didn't come from those places.
Yeah. Oh, fascinating. I want to talk about those second and third points in more detail. Let's start with the first, because I mean, it comes up it's come up regularly in conversations outside of the podcast, but this has been a topic I've addressed with others before as well. So this, you could be a leader without fulfilling all of the requirements. And you said that's more, it's predominantly a more feminine view to think the reverse of that. The thing I'm interested in, how did you come to that realization? I guess might be the thing.
Sure. Here's one that's not specifically leadership, but it's kind of parallel. I once almost didn't apply for a job because it said, as one of the listings, not necessarily a requirement, but it felt like a requirement in the bullet points of the job listing. It said specializing in a Turkic language of Central Asia, right? So this is when I was still in academia. And I'm
Yeah.
like, well, I wrote my dissertation on a language that's a little bit spoken in Central Asia, but it's really more European Turkic language. So maybe I shouldn't apply for this job. I was literally the most qualified person in the country for that position. And I almost talked myself out of it because of that one. Retrospectively, it seems ridiculous, but at the time, it felt very reasonable. And I see parallels with that. Another thing is that I co-designed and co-ran for a couple of years an executive sponsorship program at a tech company that was a client of mine. They had asked me to come in and interview people who had recently left to find out, why are we hemorrhaging people who are women, people who are men of color? Why are we hemorrhaging people? Why is our leadership and our succession bench, why is it almost all
Yeah.
white men? And so I had run these interviews and I said, your problem is professional development, right? There are people who are leaving because they aren't being taken care of. So we did this thing to get executives, lower level, but by the second year, the CEO was involved. So not the highest level executives, but arranged
Sure.
with people who were high performers and weren't white men, used mostly women. And it was so interesting. And I would guide them in, here's the conversations to have. And we would run education programs and all of these things. And we would have in-person events. And a thing I found again and again and again is that the stories of the men and how they'd gotten into the leadership positions, because some of them were the same age as their female proteges, right? Or
Yeah.
a year or two older. Well, why was this woman at this level and this man so many levels above her? Again and again, it came that the women would talk to me and say, and he said, well, I can do about 50% of this job and I can level up and I can learn on the job and I trust myself to learn, so I'll apply. And they were like, I don't meet 100%. I'm not even at 90%. I can't possibly. So this kind of difference that I see is very gendered, and we found a lot of research that showed that was the case.
Yes.
And so,
Yeah.
but to hear it directly from women helped me get my own insights to myself. I'm like, oh yeah, there's stuff I turned down that retrospectively I should not have turned down. So
Yeah. Wow. That's great. And is that linked in any way to the motto that you mentioned around don't try for perfection?
absolutely. Perfectionism is so problematic in so many ways, but it's very much, here's more research. It's what happens when you talk to a former professor who still does a lot of research. there's a lot of research that shows that perfectionism is part of what we call imposter syndrome, right? So it's not just, oh, I don't deserve to be here, but imposter syndrome shows up in many ways. And people say to people, oh, don't be a perfectionist or don't have imposter syndrome. But it's actually a very rational response to data that comes at people. So if you've got two people
Yes.
and one is assessed positively and one is assessed less positively, you start to internalize, or you start to think, well, I have to do more and better. And in some respects, it's true. And in other respects, it's like, oh, let's just fix the system, because you've got all of these people burning out, emptying out, not taking that, doing self-limiting things, um, and taking them sort of taking themselves out of that succession leadership bench, all the succession planning. So the more that we can figure out, why is there perfectionism? How is it harming individuals? And what's coming at people? What's the bias that's coming at people that they're having a very rational response to be perfectionist? How can we remove those pressures on people? Then everything becomes more sustainable and more equitable.
Great. Thank you. Now, your second and third point, they're counterbalancing each other in some way. So there's like showing up, taking off the mask, but recognizing that some people still need to wear one to protect them from harm. That's kind of that may be a poor shorthand, Suzanne. That
No, it's a
help me
perfect
kind of
shorthand.
the tension here that can play out for some people.
So I'll give an example from my own leadership experience. So one thing is, I used to run teams of teaching assistants for a term, right? And so I used to teach large intro classes, sometimes as big as 400 students at a time, undergrads. And I would have a team of sometimes 8 teaching assistants. And I tend to be very equitable and very low key when giving commands. So I would tell people to do things in a way that, for some of them, because I was female, and this includes female TAs, so it wasn't,
Yeah.
I'm not saying men didn't take me seriously. I'm just saying specifically people who were my reports, because it wasn't a job, it was a teaching assistant job, even though academia is very hierarchical and I was higher on the hierarchy. I would say things, and it was framed in a way that there was one problem group in particular that towards the end of the term, I had to say to them, you're not hearing that this is an imperative. Like, I might not be using the command form in English, but when I
Yeah.
say to you, it would be good if by Friday you blah, 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 you should hear that as, oh, damn, Wertheim by Friday needs me to do this thing and I'm going to do it. So there was a way in which I was trying to show up as my authentic self, but I had to put on more of the shield of the commanding officer type thing, right? I don't come from a
Yes.
command and control type leadership. But for people in other positions, it can be even worse, right? So I collect a lot of data, for example, from Black women, and some of it's from the UK. Most of it is from the US. And I have multiple stories of Black women speaking with authority. So as a linguist, there are different ways that you can speak authoritatively. One of them is giving a command. I would say things like, it would be good if, but you could just say, do it by Friday, right? So that's more authoritative. Or I would be like, well, it's kind of like this, or sort of da-da-da. Like, I would use these terms that are called hedges, but you might speak without the hedge. Here's how it's going to be, right? And I've got multiple things where Black women speaking with authority were described as attacking, especially if they were giving critical feedback to people who genuinely needed it. We all know that reports are learning things. And so one of the ways of being a leader is, how do you give critical feedback to somebody in a way that lands well? And it turns out that for some people, just being who you are in a leadership position is enough to trigger anger if you give somebody critical feedback. So a lot of people who come from marginalized groups have to spend so much time figuring out literally just the mechanics of, how do I show up as a persona that gets people to work well with me and for me? And sometimes the answer is, for all the work you put in, it doesn't even matter. So this is true for a lot of women of color. I'm perceived as a woman of color by many people. Literally have to degree themselves, credential themselves, have letters after their names in order to be taken seriously.
Right.
So it's a really complicated problem.
Yeah. So the accreditation aspect is one of those. You use the word shield or kind of mask that you might have to bring
Mhm,
with you to give that authority or that
mhm.
sense of power in those situations. Oh, yeah. So it's interesting. So there's kind of masking, there's sort of removing masks to encourage authenticity, vulnerability, openness that we're wanting people, or that we're encouraging people to communicate so we can see the real them. But but it's complicated. It's more complicated than that because people are going to need to put those on to be able to function effectively in the social structure that they've entered into and to be able to be taken seriously or for their voice to be heard or for them to be seen to be able to impact the business, that kind of thing. So,
Absolutely. And a lot of people
right.
have to do, even just to go into a workplace in the UK or the US, have to do what sometimes is called covering or code switching. And they already
Yeah.
have to take themselves and compress themselves into something smaller and show only a limited bandwidth of themselves in order to be seen, for example, as professional. So where I am, the word professional, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, the word professional, if you dig deep into the behavior that's described as professional, for example, language variety, how someone is speaking, it really is somebody speaking a standard or prestige dialect, which is associated with whiteness and speaking in ways that are associated with whiteness and in specifically white men. So white male ways of communication are seen as professional and other ways are often seen as unprofessional. So speaking of shielding, a lot of people have to come in masked already. So
So what can leaders do to help in those situations, to support in those situations?
there's this idea that if you're talking about someone being authentic, I think as a leader, it's important for you to do enough research to understand what the range of an authentic self is and what obstacles a person might face if they were genuinely going to bring more of themselves and show more of themselves in a workplace.
I guess the intent of what's being asked is, look, we want you to bring your best version of you to work, and I guess there's something around that, and trying to make sure you're not wearing lots of masks so we can kind of
Right.
communicate with each other clearly. There was probably something around that that's the intent of that, but clearly that may not be helpful. So what could they be asking if they should be asking that at all?
So I will tell you, it's ironic because I've just published a book on inclusive language. And here I'm going to say, at this point, I think it has to be action. There are times that people who are looking to see if a place is safe, for example, job candidates, I talk to people, I help companies improve, for example, their websites because people will go to a website and scan the website. Is this a place that I could thrive? And sometimes people want to put, for example, stock photos of people from groups who don't actually work, at that company.
Yes.
And I'm like, you can't pretend to be the company that you're not yet. You can put out a statement saying, we're working on diversifying our workforce. Here are the steps we're taking. So I think it's a similar thing for a leader to try to signal prematurely that an organization is ready for someone to be authentic. I don't think that's a good thing. I think the way to signal is through actions. And so, for example, if you're in charge of performance reviews, you can say something like, I'm going to work on debiasing performance reviews, right? Because performance reviews, so example here, let me bring an inclusive language thing. There are a lot of double standards that show up in performance reviews. And so a 2014 study showed in a computers, they used computer systems to analyze hundreds and hundreds of performance reviews. And they found that only women were described as abrasive in performance reviews. But men had corresponding positive ways of describing them. Assertive, on point, bold, courageous, right?
Sure.
So one thing you could do is say, because this is part of the stuff that you want people to feel psychologically safe and that their contributions are being recognized and seen. So instead of saying, be yourself, well, if being yourself means that you get negative feedback and you're told, oh, you're really shrill or you're so abrasive or you're unprofessional, instead you can say things like, I'm going to work on making sure work allocations are equitable. So one thing that's happening right now is adjacency bias. So we've got offices where some people have come back to work and other people are working remote. So even that, it doesn't even have to be your ethnicity or your race or your gender, but it can be your location. How can we make
Yes.
sure that I don't give that juicy job that juicy assignment to someone just because I ran into them in the kitchen, right? And I started talking about it and I gave it to them. How can I make sure there's an equitable distribution of work? And I think those kinds of actions are what allow people to feel safer and safer. And the safer you feel, the more you can bring more of yourself into a place.
Yeah, great. So, yeah, fostering, I guess, behaviors and language that help people to feel safe. I mean, there's lots of talk of psychological safety in the world
Mm,
today, and trying to creating that environment. Um, Now, you've mentioned your book, and I'd like to talk about that now. Uh, the inclusive language field guide. Sorry, nearly got it wrong. So you've got six powerful principles to that as a checklist to help evaluate language and the
right.
likes. Now, I know you've been on other podcasts, and this book released in October this year, so I'm really pleased it's out there as a practical guide. Which of those six principles is important for you to talk about right now? Would you say? Because we won't get into all of them in detail, but which of
Oh,
those would you like to
let me
talk about?
list them. And as I'm listing them, so people get the framework of how it
Yeah,
fits in. And then as I'm listing them, I'll think about which one to talk about.
great.
So they are reflect reality, show respect, draw people in, incorporate other perspectives. I think that's going to be it. Incorporate other perspectives, prevent erasure, and recognize pain points. For a leader, incorporating other perspectives is the answer, because isn't that really what leadership is? It's good to educate yourself as much as possible about the obstacles that people who aren't you might be facing that you might not see. One great way to do that is diversifying your media consumption and diversifying your social media consumption. I would follow disability activists, Black activists, Asian activists, or just famous Black people, famous Asian people. Didn't even have to be activists, people who were different from me. And I was again and again surprised. A public thing would happen, and I would be on Twitter, and I thought that I knew, like I've got a PhD, I research stuff, I know what the response is going to be. And again, the perspective and the response was so different from what I thought it would be, that it was again and again a learning experience. And so incorporating other perspectives, the more that you can learn what is and isn't going well for your people, I think the better it will be.
The whole conversation raises some questions for me, which I'd love your support on. So, some of the examples that we've talked about today, I guess I'm part of a dominant group, which is male, and I'm white. Although, again, similar to you, people are not sure if that's the case. But I'm afraid of saying the wrong thing,
Mm,
and potentially I say nothing. And so, how to use inclusive language and if you think about the field guide there, certainly I try to be curious. I try to ask questions and get into other people's shoes. And I'm thinking particularly in terms of commenting on social media, as an example. I
sure.
was like, okay, I'm not going to even go there because the fear of being cancelled or the fear of being, getting into some heated debate just to have an opinion can turn into, I've seen other kind of fireballs going down around other individuals. So
Right.
it's now that's not seeking sympathy. It's like genuine, like, oh, where do I go then? Because I'm in one of these dominant groups. Although there's aspects of me that are not on face value that I'm marginalized,
Right.
but you can't see that.
Right.
Um, yeah. So I don't know. There's a question in there somewhere. What, like,
Sure.
any tips on, like, I'm feeling afraid to speak or say the wrong thing, so I don't upset someone. I don't want to use exclusive language,
Right.
but then perhaps shut down communicating appropriately at all.
I mean,
Any thoughts on that?
what you're talking about is incredibly common. And I talk about that with the executives that I work with a lot, because executive teams in the US tend to be white men, right? So it's the same thing.
Mm,
And so I contrast inclusive language and problematic language. Those are my two
sure.
buckets. Either it's inclusive
Yeah.
or it's problematic. I give the top examples. And I would say the first thing to do is think, what are my biggest areas of risk and how can I Like, what if I had the least access to data? I call it a data deficit, right? So I
Yeah.
would say, first of all, feel confident that if you know how to be polite, you know how to be polite. You just have to make up for your data deficit, right? So what did the culture not think was important for me to know back then? And what does the culture now say it's important for me to know? It can take a lot of practice to start to talk about the world in a way that reflects reality and incorporates other perspectives. Eventually, people who are non-binary or love somebody non-binary, people who are intersex, people who are genderqueer, people who are any of the things that don't fit in the gender binary, will start to see that you haven't stepped on a minor. If you have, you're like, oh, sorry, and you just do a quick fix. Or that you, when somebody has pronouns like they, them, you put in an effort. And I have to tell you that your brain is going to make it hard to say they, them at first for a single known person, because it's a
Yeah,
grammar
I've been
change
there.
and you got to practice.
Yes. Yeah.
But you're allowed to make a mistake. You're allowed. And people who tell you're not allowed to make a mistake are creating problems. But a person
Sure.
who has genuine intentions and says oh, I'm sorry, I mean they, and goes on, no one's going to get mad at that. Like, you have to practice and get better.
Can I zoom up on the gender thing? It just the
Hmm.
experience I had over the weekend, actually. Again, it maybe links to my conversation earlier. So I do try to follow groups and individuals who are not like me. One of those is a group on LinkedIn. It's called the Female Lead, I think, something like that. So it's promoting women in leadership and encouraging that. It's just one of the groups. And there was a post on Saturday I was looking at. Maybe it was in my consciousness preparing for today as well. But it was like a bit of man shaming is what I would call it. Kind of this lady saying who has had contact from their husband or their partner, since they've come out tonight. And they were kind of joking that, or mocking that, some partners had asked their spouse to order them a pizza when they were going out for the night, this kind of thing. But there was a comment that said something like, I would never marry a man, they're useless, in the chat. And this is one of those things that's like, oh wow, that's pretty strong, so I'm trying to stay open to different perspectives. But I also think, well, if that was, I'd never marry a woman, they're useless, or I'd never marry fill in the blanks, they're useless, like I'm sure it would have got much stronger backlash. I feel there's a pendulum swing where we try and be more tolerant of each other, but then it's like, well, we can attack the man in the room. It is something that as being one of those, doesn't feel particularly safe. That was one of those. Do I comment? I thought, no, it's not even worth going there. I don't know who this person is. I don't really value their opinion. But if it was a racist comment, I would hope I would say something. But because it's a sexist comment towards a man, I was like, wow, no, I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to even attempt to kind of correct, whether it's correct or just give an alternative, because it was just like, this is the wrong place or time. And I haven't got the energy to try and deal with all the responses that will come from it. So that, I don't know if that's helpful to share, but it's on my mind as we're talking around that. It's like, oh, why is that okay?
It's super helpful to share it. I want to jump in. One thing that's very interesting about social media is it lets us eavesdrop on in-group conversations in a way that you couldn't unless you were until very recently, physically in a location, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a kind of a venting that will happen in an in-group conversation that really isn't for another audience. So sometimes when we are overhearing an in-group conversation that allows venting, that feels like a safe space, we hear things that are stronger than we would ever hear, and they can feel bad. Having said that, I would describe that comment as problematic language, right? Because it is problematic because it's not incorporating other perspectives and it's not reflecting reality, in fact, which is my number one perspective.
Yeah.
So let me explain now again. This is why I say we need to focus on behavior and not identity. And there are a bunch of reasons why. And one of the reasons is that some people feel that because they're a member of a marginalized group, they get a pass and they're allowed to say anything. Yeah. So I think that calling out that behavior and saying, oh, this is problematic, and you can frame it in inclusive language or inclusive behavior. Yeah. So I think that frustration will lead people to snap and make a statement that clearly isn't true. Men are useless, but at a time of incredible frustration, and I would say actual pain, because psychological pain sets off the same things in the brain as physical pain. Just like you might curse and use stronger words if you stub your toe, I feel like this was maybe stronger language than in a non-painful moment that person might have used. But I still
Sure.
also, when you're not in group, it's not your place to correct, right? Like that's got to be, I'm sure that other women, if they had time, were like, that wasn't like, maybe let's
Mm.
frame it this way instead of
Quite a lot of
the
love hearts
identity.
for that one, unfortunately. But anyway, we won't go there. So,
Yeah.
this has been fascinating.
I'm so glad.
I am learning a lot, and it's helpful. I'm not sure I've fully got this understanding. How did your research or passion for this area begin? Where did it start for you?
I mean, let's go deep if we're going to. I was 5 years old and I skipped kindergarten and I went directly into first grade, as it's called here. And I remember being dropped in, and everybody already knew each other because they had been in kindergarten together. Or everybody knew at least a bunch of people because they had been in kindergarten together. And I was meeting them all for the first time. And I looked and I'm like, terrified, terrified, terrified. And I can feel that there are rules that I don't understand. And honestly, it felt like it was for my survival. Like, how can I fit in these people and not be made fun of and not be an outcast and not be? So I literally began studying what are these secret rules of human communication, literally when I was 5 years old. And then decades and decades later, when I started linguistics grad school, that wasn't what I was going to do. I was going to study something completely different, just basic language acquisition. How do human beings acquire language and the niceties of that? But then I switched around, and then the only way to answer my dissertation question, which is how does if you've got a dominant language and then a minority language that's stigmatized and smaller and maybe that's shrinking away, why does the grammar of one change so much and the grammar of the other doesn't change at all? And the only answer I found in Russia in 2001, identity and power and culture, who you are, who you're talking to, how you think about yourself, how you relate to the power structures around you drastically affects how you talk, including the very grammar and syntax that you use. And so that sparked it again. And so ever since then, the lessons that I learned in Russia, I actually apply to inclusive language because they're the same. So
Yeah,
they're the same. Like these are universal principles of what makes a conversation be respectful and take other people into consideration and make them feel good and build trust. And conversely, what makes a conversation go off the rails. So those are the 2 points. Kindergarten and dissertation research are my 2 inflection points.
thank you. I appreciate you sharing that. Wonderful. Well, what advice or insight would you offer to someone coming into the workplace around this topic that would help them? Something from your field guide, perhaps, that would
Sure.
help somebody.
Sure. It's that, like any new language skills, you have to acquire them a little bit at a time. A lot of people freak out and they're very nervous. And we talked about the idea of cancel culture, but in my book, I specifically wrote it to be secretly a 6-month course that you can do in the privacy of your own home. So for each principle in the chapter, it ends with 3 activities you can practice just a little bit each day or a few times a week to change how you see things and to change the language you yourself produce. Don't make it here. Avoid trying to be perfect up front. Say, I have to learn. I have to practice a little bit each day, and I'm going to make mistakes, but people will see my good intentions, and that is what's going to matter the most. So be fearless and genuinely practice.
Great. I love that message. That's helpful. I'm going to take that away from this call. You mentioned it a few times earlier around, you know, quickly. You can do quick fix. You don't have to be perfection in this area, and it's moving all the time as well. I'm observing, so it's like just trying to be attentive to what's going on. The more data, I think, is that you mentioned earlier, that would be really helpful for me, and I'm sure others as well. Now, with regards to getting access to your book, I'm sure they can on Amazon, but it's in bookshops in the UK as well, isn't it? I think you
That's
mentioned. So
correct.
how do I
That's
get
correct.
hold of the field guide in the UK?
In the UK, you can go to WH Smith or you can go to Waterstones, but you can do Amazon UK. And it also does. It's nice if you go to your I personally like independent bookstores a lot. Go to your independent bookstore and request it. They can get access to a copy quite easily and get it for you reasonably quickly.
Yeah.
And it's also an audiobook and an ebook. So if that's however you prefer to consume it, if you've enjoyed my dulcet tones, you can listen to them for 7 hours and 56 minutes because I read it nice and slow so people can understand I have a lot of concepts in there. So I read it slow. So if you listen to it 1.25, I don't sound like I'm on helium.
Thanks, Suzanne. That's great. What's something you're taking away from this conversation?
How nice it is when people are genuinely curious and want to learn about different areas of the world. I love good conversations, and that's a thing during the pandemic I've really missed a lot. And so I'm taking away my attitude towards the world is it's filled with so much, and I want to know so much. And when I encounter somebody else who's also genuinely curious, it's the best. It's the best. I've genuinely enjoyed our conversation.
Likewise. And another thing that I'm still processing, but I'm really pleased you put it into my consciousness is, this idea of the mask wearing and taking it off, but also recognizing that some people still need that. When you referred to as a shield, I quite like that thought process that, that helps them to actually function well in certain environments as well. So it's not just as simple as be vulnerable, be authentic, or whatever. It's sparked some really good thinking around that for me. I appreciate you sharing that analogy or metaphor or whatever the word is. It's great. Suzanne, thank you. Thanks. I wish you the very best success with your work and your book as well, and that people were able to seek that out to help them in their quest to be more inclusive in their behaviors, not just their language, I think is the message I've taken from today. So thank you. Very best of success, and I hope we can get to speak again as you come up with another bit of literature that helps the world in a couple of years' time. Who knows? Okay.
Give me time. But thank you so much for having me. It's been a delight.
Okay. Enjoy your break in forest bathing. I'm mildly envious. Okay, thank you. We'll see you again. Our after dinner leadership conversation is finished. Our guest has left, and you're still here. Now, of course, you're very welcome. I'm glad that you found the conversation to be engaging. There's a few things that I'd like to ask you to do before you do leave. The first one of those is if you can stop and think about somebody who you think would enjoy this conversation, a friend, a colleague, perhaps an aspiring leader. The second thing is to stop and hit subscribe or follow. And then the third thing is to start doing something. Perhaps there's a little idea or a concept that we've been discussing today that you think you could apply even a little bit tomorrow, tonight, and to put it into action. I encourage you to use this as a catalyst to do something different, do something more interesting, do something more exciting. And thank you so much for joining us. And please tune in again for another after dinner leadership conversation. You can leave now. I need to go and do the dishes.